For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, the 6th of June, 1944, didn't start with a bang. It started with a cold, clinging mist that seemed to swallow the English Channel whole. He was 32 years old, a man who had already seen the worst of the Eastern Front, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the silence of that morning. He stood in a concrete observation post, nestled into the cliffs above what the maps called Sector Vierville, but what the world would soon know as Omaha Beach. To Richter and his men, the Atlantic Wall wasn't the invincible fortress the radio described. It was a thin, brittle line of concrete and sweat, manned by a collection of veterans, teenagers, and conscripts who were all waiting for a storm they weren't sure would ever come. As the sun began to struggle against the gray horizon, Richter raised his binoculars. He saw a smudge. At first he thought it was a trick of the light or a low-hanging cloud, but the smudge sharpened. It grew teeth. Within minutes the gray veil of the channel lifted, and Richter's heart stopped. The sea was gone. In its place was a floating city made of steel and intent. He wasn't looking at a fleet. He was looking at the largest concentration of power ever assembled by human hands. Nearly 7,000 ships were carved out of the fog, an iron horizon that stretched as far as he could see to the left and to the right. The shock was physical. Richter felt the sudden, crushing weight of reality. For months, German intelligence had insisted the invasion would hit Calais. They were so sure of it that they had left Normandy dangerously thin. Even the weather had lied to them. A massive storm on June 5th had convinced the High Command that no sane commander would launch a fleet. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man responsible for the defense, was actually hundreds of miles away in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday with a pair of handmade shoes as a gift. The Germans were asleep, and the world was arriving on their doorstep. Richter scrambled for the field telephone. His fingers were stiff as he cranked the handle and waited for the divisional headquarters to pick up. When he finally got through, his voice was thick with the adrenaline of a man who has just seen his own death. He reported the fleet. The officer on the other end of the line was silent for a moment, then laughed. He told Richter that it was probably a phantom or a small distraction. The weather was too bad, he said. It was impossible. Richter didn't argue. He didn't have time. He shouted into the receiver that he was looking at thousands of ships, and that if they didn't believe him, they would believe the shells that were about to fall. He tried the regimental command next. The major there was just as skeptical, asking Richter if he was certain of what he was seeing. Richter looked out the observation slit at the massive barrels of the Allied battleships as they began to swing toward the coast. He told the major that the weather was clear enough to see the end of the world, and that it was currently sitting in the middle of the English Channel. He hung up before the major could respond. He didn't need orders anymore. He had a duty to his men, even if that duty was just to lead them through the next few hours of carnage. Richter's artillery battery consisted of 4 105mm guns buried deep in reinforced bunkers. He gave the order to fire at 5:55 a.m. The floor of the bunker jumped as the first shells left the barrels. His target was the USS Corey, an American destroyer that had ventured too close to the shore. Richter watched through his glass as the plumes of water erupted around the ship. A direct hit sent a column of black smoke into the air. For a split second his men cheered. They felt the rush of a successful strike, the belief that they could actually fight back. But the cheer died in their throats. For every shell Richter sent into the channel, the Allies sent 100 back. The retaliation was a physical force. The Allied battleships, including the massive USS Texas and USS Arkansas, opened fire with their 14-inch guns. The sound wasn't like a normal explosion. It was the sound of the atmosphere being torn in half. The ground beneath Richter's feet didn't just shake. It heaved like a living thing. The massive concrete walls of his bunker, 3 feet thick, began to crack and shed dust. He realized then that the Atlantic Wall was a lie. It was a stage set, and the Allies were about to pull the curtain down. As the morning wore on, Richter's perspective shifted from the terror of the moment to a cold, analytical despair. He looked at the sky and saw it was black with aircraft. There were no Messerschmitts to meet them. He looked at the sea and saw thousands of landing craft, each one carrying more men than he had in his entire sector. He started to do the math in his head, a calculation that every German veteran of the Eastern Front eventually learned to fear. This wasn't a fight between soldiers. This was a fight between economies. Richter thought about the Tiger tanks he had seen being built in Germany, handcrafted, complex machines that took months to finish. Then he thought about the Shermans. He had heard that for every Tiger the Germans built, the Americans built 100 Shermans. He realized that the men in the landing craft weren't just soldiers. They were the representatives of the assembly lines in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Birmingham. While Germany was recycling pots and pans to make bullets, the Americans were drowning the continent in steel. It wasn't just military superiority. It was industrial inevitability. No amount of Nazi willpower or propaganda could stop a factory that never slept. Below his position, the landing craft hit the sand. Richter watched as the ramps dropped and the first wave of American infantry stepped into a wall of lead. The machine gunners in the bunkers beside him, particularly the infamous beast of Omaha, Heinrich Severloh, began a rhythmic, endless slaughter. The water at the shoreline turned a deep, sickening red. Bodies began to pile up like driftwood. From Richter's vantage point, it looked for a moment like the invasion might fail. The Americans were pinned down, hiding behind steel obstacles, unable to move forward. But then Richter saw something that convinced him the war was truly over. 2 American destroyers, seeing the infantry being butchered, did the unthinkable. They didn't stay at a safe distance. They steamed directly toward the beach, their hulls scraping the sand, coming so close that they were practically aground. From point-blank range, they began to fire their 5-inch guns directly into the German bunker apertures. Richter watched as the positions that had been holding the line were systematically erased, one by one. The Americans weren't following a manual. They were improvising with a level of aggression and resources that the German army couldn't match. By noon, Richter's battery was a ruin. One of his guns had been silenced by a direct hit, its crew vaporized. His telephone lines were shredded. He was an officer without a command, standing in a room full of dust and the smell of cordite. He looked up through the shattered roof of his observation post and saw the sky was still full of Allied planes. There was no end to them. He realized that June 6th wasn't just a battle. It was a revelation. The Third Reich had been built on the idea that they were a superior race with a superior destiny. But the reality was much simpler. They were a medium-sized country that had picked a fight with the world, and the world had finally shown up to settle the debt. Richter eventually walked out of his bunker and looked at the men who were still alive. They were covered in gray dust, their eyes wide and hollow. They looked at him for an answer, for a reason to keep fighting, but he had nothing to give them. The war in Normandy would drag on for weeks, a bloody, grinding mess in the hedgerows. But Richter knew the truth from that first hour in the mist. The invasion hadn't just broken the Atlantic Wall. It had broken the myth of German power. As he watched the endless stream of trucks, tanks, and men pouring onto the beach, he realized that the end wasn't a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. The world had arrived, and it wasn't leaving until the fire was out.